In the beginning, the Lord God Almighty created the heavens and the earth. During the 7 days of creation, God placed a firmament above the earth to divide the waters above and below, with the dry land in between. In the year 4171 BC, God created the race of man, and from this race, he divided them into male and female. The first couple were named Adam and Eve. In 2515 BC, after many generations, the great continent of Pangaea was overflowed by a great flood of water. After 371 days, the waters receded back into their original places. Though all people were killed, one family managed to survive. And from the family, the direct descendants of Adam, the world's population of man, began to sprout again. After many more generations, during the life of a man named Peleg, the great continent of Pangaea had divided into the continents that we know today. As the human population began to recover from the Great Flood, several powerful cities began coalescing into powerful empires. One of the first empires was formed in 2334 BC, the Akkadian Empire. Based in the mythical city of Akkad, the Akkadian Empire conquered much of the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent. Sadly, the Akkadian Empire collapsed in 2154 BC, resulting in a dark age. By 2151 BC, a man named Terah, who had been born and lived most of his life during the Akkadian Empire, decided to move his family from the city of to the land of Canaan, a prosperous yet evil land. Unfortunately, he only made it to the city of Haran when he decided to stay and actually settle. By 2091 BC, his son, Abram, at 75 years old, urged by God, decided to leave for Canaan. After some time of living in the land, a terrible famine swept the land, and as a result, Abraham fled to Egypt. But after a short visit, he was forced to flee and returned to Canaan after getting on the wrong side of Pharaoh Intef II. By 2090 BC, the Elamite Empire had conquered a vast amount of territory. That year, several kings along the Jordan River Valley rebelled against the Elamite rule, and as a result, the Elamites gathered a massive army and conquered the northern lands of Canaan that had rebelled. The following year, they turned on the southern kings, and at the Battle of Siddim, the Elamites defeated the coalition army. But unfortunately, the Elamites then made the mistake of plundering, pillaging, and burning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, for their mistake was kidnapping a man named Lot. And only a short time later, a man named Abram, Lot's uncle, came with 318 men, massacred most of the Elamites, driving them back and freeing his nephew. The Elamites would never again hold control over the southern Canaanite cities. In 1886 BC, ironically in the land of Egypt, the pharaoh of Senweseret III suffered 2 terrible nightmares which he believed were warnings sent by the gods. Fortunately, an Egyptian slave successfully interpreted the pharaoh's dreams, and he informed Pharaoh what the Lord God Almighty was about to do. For a period of 7 years, a great abundance of food was coming to Egypt. But after those 7 years of abundance, a period of another 7 years was coming, but this one of great famine, one of the greatest famines in ancient history. As a result, the pharaoh appointed this man as the governor of all of Egypt, second only to the pharaoh, and this man's name was Joseph. By 1876, Joseph's father, Jacob, the descendant of Abram, then called Abraham, decided to move his family to Egypt to avoid the famine in Canaan. Joseph told them to settle in the land of Goshen, so you will be close to me. As the Great Famine swept Mesopotamia, many peoples began migrating to Egypt. One such group was the Hyksos, who in 1657 rebelled against the Egyptians using their mastery of the chariot. They swiftly conquered much of northern Egypt, and adding insult to injury, the kingdom of Cush, based in the city of Kerma, conquered much of southern Egypt, forcing the pharaohs to flee to the city of Thebes, barely able to survive. In 1576 BC, as the Egyptians slowly reclaimed their lost ground, the pharaohs began to fear that the Hebrews, who lived in Goshen, would soon turn on the Egyptians and ally themselves with the Hyksos. So to prevent this, Pharaoh Wahunk-Intef V annexed the land of Goshen and enslaved all of the Hebrews. By 1542 BC, Pharaoh Ahmose finally reclaimed the lost territory from the Hyksos, expelling them for good. As the pharaohs conquered the southern kingdom of Cush, the fear of foreigners coming in and taking over their land was still alive. So as a result, in 1526 BC, Pharaoh Amenhotep ordered that all Hebrew baby boys were to be killed. This was done to prevent the population from getting out of Egyptian control. But thankfully, one baby was saved by the Lord God Almighty, and that boy's name was Moses. In 1486 BC, Moses, now 40 years old, was forced to flee to the land of Midian after killing an Egyptian slave master. Then in 1446 BC, Moses, called by God, returned from his exile to Egypt and demanded that Pharaoh Thutmose III free the Hebrews. For a short time, the Pharaoh refused, but after the 10 plagues swept all of Egypt, Pharaoh Thutmose III agreed, and he allowed the Hebrews to leave. However, only a short time passed before the Pharaoh became angry at his decision and sent his army of 10,000 to bring back the Hebrews in chains. However, when the Egyptian army caught up with the Hebrews at the Red Sea, the Egyptian army was wiped out as it tried to cross the Red Sea. All 10,000 men perished. At last, the Hebrews were now free of Egyptian control. Over the next 2 years, Moses led the Hebrews wandering around the Sinai Peninsula worshiping the Lord. However, once they did arrive at the land of Canaan, Moses sent 12 spies to scour the land, but most of the spies returned home saying that they could not take the land because of the large cities and the people who were there. And as a result, the Hebrews refused to go into the land. Angered over this, God told Moses that the Hebrews had to spend the next 38 years in the desert. But ironically, this time in the desert ultimately helped the Hebrews out, because in 1422 BC, Pharaoh Amenhotep II, angered over the loss of so many slaves all those years ago, decided to go on a massive campaign into the land of Canaan. But this was not a campaign of conquest. This was a campaign of plunder. And he plundered the land for slaves, killing thousands as he went. But Amenhotep captured over 100,000 people to become Egypt's new slaves. Finally, Moses then led the Israelites back to the land of Canaan, and by 1406 BC, they were at the border of Canaan. However, that year, Moses died at 120 years old, and his successor, Joshua, took over as the new leader of the Hebrews. And he would be the one to cross over the Jordan River, and by 1398 BC, 8 years of conquest, Canaan became the land of the Hebrews, which they renamed to honor their ancestor Jacob, Israel, and their people would be called the Israelites. Sadly, in 1356 BC, Joshua died, and there would not be another true leader for Israel for many more years. But with his death, a new era emerged for the Israelites, what I call the era of the judges. Over this period, they would be raided constantly by the Amalekites, Moabites, Ammonites, Arameans, and Midians. And as a result, God called up what the Israelites called a judge, a leader temporarily brought up to defeat every single one of these attacks. Adding an insult to this injury, during this cycle of apostasy, of worshiping God, then turning back to idols, the Israelites found themselves under the influence of outside powers, the northern Hittite Empire and the southern Empire of Egypt. And these two powers actually fought over the influence of the region multiple times, including the famous Battle of Kadesh. Then, in 1177 BC, a group of foreign people, only known as the Sea People, raided up and down the Egyptian, Israelite, and Hittite coast. Then in 1175 BC, a group of the Sea People settled the land just off the border of the tribe of Judah, and this land would eventually become Philistine or Philistia. Then in 1094 BC, these Philistines launched a raid and successfully defeated the Israelites at the Battle of Ebenezer Ephet. As a result, 34,000 Israelites were killed in these two engagements, with roughly 1,000 Philistines being killed. Adding an insult to injury, the Philistines captured the mighty Ark of the Covenant and held it in their territory for about 7 months. Finally, in 1052 BC, during the lifetime of the last judge, the great prophet Samuel, the Israelites came to him saying, "We want a king." So that year, God told Samuel to anoint a man named Saul to be the first king of the Israelites. And Saul was a very good leader. He led the Israelites into a series of great victories, including his first against the Philistines, the Battle of Michmash Pass. Roughly 200 Israelites were killed or wounded in this attack, but the Philistines suffered 50,000 dead. The Philistines were crippled by this defeat, but they were not done. Saul successfully defended the tribes of Israel from every outside enemy. Then in 1025 BC, the Philistines returned and launched a new campaign into the lands. This time, they brought a massive giant named Goliath to fight the Israelites. However, thanks to the bravery and spirit-filled boy named David, Goliath was killed in a battle and David was proclaimed a hero. Over the next several years, Saul took David on many military campaigns against Israel's enemies. But by 1011 BC, tensions between Saul and David had now boiled over, and David, ironically, was forced to flee with 600 men to the land of the Philistines. Being very clever, David used the protection of the Philistines to raid several of Israel's enemies. But the following year, in 1010 BC, the Philistines launched a new campaign into Israel, and as a result, Saul was finally killed in this attack. After the defeat, David traveled to the city of Hebron, where the people proclaimed him the new king of Israel. However, there was a problem. The northern tribes backed Saul's last surviving son, Ishbosheth, and proclaimed him the new king. Over the next years, the nation was divided into a civil war, but by the year 1008 BC, Ishbosheth was murdered and David was proclaimed the new king of all of Israel. Then in the year 1003 BC, David decided to capture the city of Jebus, which he renamed to Jerusalem, and proclaimed it to be the new capital of Israel. The capture of Jerusalem kick-started an age of conquest for David. Over the next several years, David waged numerous campaigns and built the most powerful kingdom Israel had ever seen. As part of the conquest, David captured the only land trade routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt and was able to monopolize on the trade. But unfortunately, his period of conquest met with some issues. In 979 BC, his son Absalom rebelled, and many cities and even some tribes backed Absalom's rebellion. The two factions met at the Battle of Ephraim Forest. With the Lord on his side, David defeated Absalom's army. 20,000 of Absalom's army were killed, probably only for around 500 of David's men, and Absalom himself was killed in the rout. In the last few years of the great King David's reign, David finally conquered the land of the Philistines, destroying their great cities and burning them to the ground. The great King David finally died in 970 BC, paving the way for one of Israel's greatest kings in a golden age, Solomon. And in 967 BC, he began work that his father had started, the construction of the great temple of Jerusalem. And in 960 BC, the great temple was completed. It was a magnificent temple dedicated to the Lord God Almighty. Unfortunately, even though he was the wisest and the richest king of all, he did have some problems. You see, that wisdom turned into foolishness. King Solomon is the only king in history to have 700 wives and 300 women slaves that were like wives that today we'd call concubines. When he was old, his wives caused him to turn away from the Lord and worship idols. As a result of this sin, when King Solomon died in 931 BC, the kingdom of Israel that King Saul had built, King David had forged, and King Solomon had solidified, divided into two. with 3 tribes backing King Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and the other 9 tribes backing a man named Jeroboam. Rehoboam continued to rule in the city of Jerusalem, but Jeroboam picked the city of Samaria to be his new capital. And this era of division began what I call the era of the kings. And as Israel divided into 2 kingdoms, the north and the south, the empire that King David so greatly forged fell overnight. And as Israel and Judea fought each other over the next few centuries, events outside of Israel had begun to consolidate into massive problems. In 732 BC, the Assyrian Empire had conquered nearly all of Mesopotamia and had pushed their way up to the northern border of Israel. Israel and the kingdom of Aram had been allied with each other for some time and had begun coalescing in massive raids against Judea. Seeing an opportunity, but against the wishes of God, King Ahaz formed an alliance with Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III and agreed that after the Assyrians conquered the kingdom of Aram, they would turn on Israel. And in 722 BC, under the reign of the new king Shalmaneser V, the Assyrian army turned on Israel and its last king, Hoshea. Hoshea's army was defeated in battle and was forced to return to Samaria. Fortunately, King Hoshea declared submission under the Assyrian Empire, but then went behind their backs and tried to forge an alliance with Egypt. And in response to this, the new king, Sargon II, launched a new invasion into Israel. And after another defeat in battle, King Hoshea was captured and all of Israel was annexed into the Assyrian Empire. Over 27,000 northern Israelites were taken back to Assyria. Then in 720 BC, with the mass migration of northern Israelites from the land, a new migration of Assyrians poured into the now largely unoccupied land of northern Israel, intermarrying with the population, eventually forming the culture of the Samaritans. In the year 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib, with an army of 200,000, invaded the land of Judea. But thankfully, King Hezekiah prayed to the Lord God Almighty for deliverance, and in one night, the Lord God Almighty wiped out 185,000 men of the Assyrian army, all dead. The remaining army fled back to Assyria and never returned. In 609 BC, as the Assyrian Empire was crumbling, it forged an alliance with the Kingdom of Egypt. That year, Pharaoh Necho II launched an expedition to aid Assyria in its time of need. However, as the Egyptian army crossed the lands of Judea, King Josiah, who was an ally of the rising Babylonian Empire, launched an attack against the Egyptians at the Battle of Megiddo. King Josiah was sadly killed, and the Egyptians continued on their way. Upon the Egyptians' return, Pharaoh Necho II deposed Josiah's successor and appointed Jehoiakim as the new Egyptian vassal. In 608 BC, the Assyrian Empire had fallen, and the Babylonian Empire had pushed its way up to the borders of the Kingdom of Judea. Seeing an opportunity to escape Egyptian control, King Jehoiakim defected to the Babylonians and became their new vassal. By 605 BC, King Jehoiakim then betrayed his vassalage and rebelled against Babylon. And in response, Nebuchadnezzar invaded and seized all territory except for the city of Jerusalem. Jehoiakim's successor, Jehoiachin, submitted to Babylon. But then in 597 BC, Jehoiachin rebelled again, and this time, Nebuchadnezzar did not negotiate. He defeated Jehoiakim's army and captured the city. Thousands were killed in this attack. A total of 1,000 Judean architects and special builders were repurposed for Babylonian use. 7,000 members of the military were impressed into Babylon's army, and another 2,023 people were taken as captives. King Nebuchadnezzar then established a man named Zedekiah to be the new Babylonian governor of the city. But unfortunately, in the year 588 BC, as the Babylonians were defeated in Egypt, Governor Zedekiah decided to rebel against King Nebuchadnezzar. But unfortunately, this was a critical mistake. That year, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem again, and after 3 years' siege, Jerusalem fell to Babylon, and several more captives were taken. King Zedekiah was killed, and as a result, all of Israel fell to Babylon. What's worse for the southern Israelites? The Babylonians looted Solomon's temple and then torched it, and it burned to the ground. While the southern Israelites were in exile in Babylon, the term Jew started popping up because these southern Israelites were from the kingdom of Judea, and as a result, they were then called Jews because they were from Judah or Judea. But thankfully, one of God's prophets, Isaiah, announced that they would be in exile for almost 70 years until a new king would rise and free them from their exile. Sure enough, over the next 70 years outside of the Babylonian Empire, a new kingdom, Persia, had begun to expand and now had pushed their way up to the Babylonian Empire. In 539 BC, under the reign of its king Cyrus II, the Persians attacked the Babylonian army at the Battle of Opis and defeated it. The Babylonians then retreated, and the Babylonian king abdicated the throne, and his successor Belshazzar became the last king of Babylon. Then King Cyrus and the Persians attacked Babylon and captured it in just one night. And ironically, King Cyrus read Isaiah's prophecy and was so amazed by it that after the Persians conquered the rest of the Babylonian Empire, King Cyrus announced that in 538 BC, all of the Jews who remained in Babylon were allowed to return home to Jerusalem. And that's what happened. And after 20 years of furious construction work in 516 BC, they rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem. But unfortunately, they were not out of harm's way yet. They faced a new threat back in Persia. In 483 BC, during the reign of King Xerxes, a man named Haman, who was a surviving descendant of King Agag, planned to trick King Xerxes into ordering a massive genocide of all of the Jews. So as a result, a young girl named Esther, who was close to King Xerxes, was urged by God to save her people. Sure enough, she did indeed save her people and turned the tables on Haman. Haman was then hanged and died. Then in 443 BC, a man named Nehemiah, still living in Persia, was urged by God to come home to Jerusalem, and in just 52 days, he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. And that's where the Old Testament ends. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and check me out over on Patreon. The link is in the description.